Good afternoon and welcome to our third panel of day 4 of Land of Hope and Dreams, a tribute and celebration to Dave Marsh's work and vision. This event has been a year and a half in the making, and we've assembled an absolutely all-star cast of speakers to sit down for interviews and panels like this one. And while music journalism is at the center of Dave Marsh's story, and certainly it's at the center of the panel you're about to watch, we wanted to make sure the Land of Hope and Dreams also took into account the wide range of impact that Dave Marsh has had in areas of social justice, healthcare, and building bridges between musicians and performers, between music and politics, and certainly all of our speakers can contribute to that. Before moving ahead, I want to thank my fellow steering committee members. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. This would not be possible without Danny Alexander, Chris Buhalis, Charles Hughes, Susan Martinez, Lauren Anke, Alexander Shashko, Craig Werner, and Daniel Wolf. David Cantwell was also there from the beginning in coming up with the idea to make this thing happen. I'd also like to thank our partners, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Afro-American Studies Department have helped promote this event, and the Rock Hall will also be simulcasting the Dave Marsh Spotlight Conversation on Friday, May 14th on their YouTube channel. We are also streaming this live to our YouTube channel, and all of the videos will be archived on the YouTube channel, as well as the Land of Hope and Dreams website. You'll see the closed captioning is turned on in Zoom right now. If you want to get it off of your screen, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom window. It should say live transcript with a CC above it, and there's a little arrow there. Click on that arrow and click disable subtitles. The chat is disabled for this Zoom, but we do have the Q&A tab open, and we encourage you to submit any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A. Finally, we are putting this on for free, and we're happy to do so. We're thrilled to be able to bring all of this to you without any charge. But if you like what you're seeing, heck, even if you don't like what you're seeing, but you feel like throwing a few dollars towards something that's doing some real good in the world, please consider the Kristen Ann Carr Fund. There's a link for the Kristen Ann Carr Fund on the Land of Hope and Dreams website. It's a foundation that was started by Dave Marsh and his wife, Barbara Carr, after the death of their daughter, Kristen, to sarcoma almost 30 years ago. The foundation does incredible work raising money for sarcoma research, as well as sarcoma fellows who then go out across the country into areas that are underserved by such specialists. So again, the Kristen Ann Carr Fund is more than a worthy cause, and we certainly hope that you'll consider donating. Before each of our panels, we're presenting some music as well. After all, a series of conversations about Dave Marsh wouldn't be complete without music. And we've got a tribute here, a message and song from Eliza Gilkison. And after that, Lauren Anke will take us into the conversation, Listening Past the Myths, with Robert Christgau, Griel Marcus, Ann Powers, and Greg Tate.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, being able to contribute something towards this wonderful tribute to Dave Marsh, who I always respected when in the early years when you knew who he was as a music journalist, and later on to become his friend, one of his many friends all over the world, was a real honor for me. And I have to say, the way Dave loved music and supported music and us musicians was quite special. And for me, especially when in the Bush years when I started to be quite political in my music, he was right there being supportive of it at a time in this country when I felt very unsure about really stepping out and being political with my music. And Dave was so right there with me, and we had so many fun conversations and fun interviews, and I'm just very happy to be here. And I thought I would pick a song that he was very supportive of me many years ago. And so this is Tender Mercies. This is for you, Dave. Across the world, she tapes explosives to her chest, steps into a shopping mall. A life devoid of all of mercy's tenderness really isn't any life at all. Tender mercies, tender mercies, come before despair. Shine down all your tender mercies. It's every mother's prayer. Down below the factory, along the riverside, children swimming in a poison pool. Playful afternoon of unintended suicide, gone before they ever even knew. Those tender mercies, tender mercies, come before despair. Shine down all your tender mercies. It's every mother's prayer. Across the world, she holds her loved ones to her chest, lays them down and listens at the door. Everybody's safe and warm among the truly blessed. How can we even dare to ask for more? Tender mercies, tender mercies, come before despair. Shine down all your tender mercies. It's every mother's prayer. Shine down all your tender mercies. It's every mother's prayer.
Hi, folks. I'm Laura Anke, most recently of NPR Music, and I'm really thrilled to be here today. Dave Marsh has been a mentor to me. I started reading, I think I might have read a first Dave Marsh column when I was about 12. And one of the things that happened to me when I first read Dave's work is what I think this panel will be about, and that's what does music writing mean for the writer and for the audience? I had a chance to meet Dave when I was 22 and I was working at Pantheon Books and he was doing some work there. We got to be friends and have been friends ever since. And he's been a big help to me and a collaborator with me on a lot of different projects. Ann Powers has said that, you have to remember if you write about music that you're a writer first and a music fan second. And I think that the power of great music writing is that it can welcome you into ideas and worlds that you didn't know about. And when I read writers that had that impact, Dave, but also everybody on this panel, Robert Christgau, Ann Powers, Tate, Griel Marcus, It helped me learn. It invited me to learn. It invited me to learn about music, about other art forms, about politics. And so I think this panel really brings together some of the most influential and flat out best music critics that have ever done the work. And I feel like my bookshelves here are coming to life. So we have today, in order that they'll be speaking, Griel Marcus, Robert Christgau, Greg Tate, and Ann Powers. I am not going to walk through their whole incredible biographies, music writing that starts in about 1970, 1969 or 70. There's over more than 60 books writing for The Village Voice and Cream and Rolling Stone and Crawdaddy and NPR Music and Playboy, daily newspapers, academic positions, and as performing musicians. Just an incredible group of people who've helped shape the way we think about music writing for 50 on years. So each of our panelists will give a sort of short presentation, and then we'll kind of all come back together to talk. So I think if we can get the technology right, my next step is to get off camera and throw this to Griel Marcus. And somebody will shout at me if I have that wrong.
Well, I'm back. Okay. I want to talk about, are you hearing me? Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. I want to talk about Cream. And I want to talk about what for me was Dave's great contribution there, which of course has followed through the rest of his life. When I first encountered Cream, it was an issue from, I guess, late 1970 that Lester Bangs sent me. He was so proud of a piece he had written called Of Pop and Pies and Fun. And I opened this tabloid publication and I started reading Lester's incredibly long piece. And I thought, this is impossible. Nobody writes like this. Nobody can get something like this published. And that was Cream. That was Dave in creating a field of freedom, a space of freedom, where not only could people do what they wanted to do, but they had to confront that invitation and say, well, what is it I really want to do? What can I do? How can I come out of myself? How can I do things I never imagined were possible? And Dave was always demanding that. He was provoking that. He was doing it by example. He was doing it by an editor. He was doing it by, is this really what you want to say? Don't you have more you want to say? And the composition of the magazine itself had that same effect, because you look through an issue and all around you, people were doing remarkable things. They were using their imaginations. They were writing with a kind of vehemence and a kind of joy that you weren't going to find anywhere else. I don't just mean in a music magazine. There really was a time from 71, 72, 73, when Cream was the best magazine in the country of any kind, in any field. And that was because of all these different voices trying to live up to the example set by all the voices around them. Oh my God, could I do anything half this good? Well, I'm going to try. I can do better than that. I've never done anything close to it before, but I have to try. So I was so thrilled by this. I began to read every issue of the magazine. I started corresponding with Dave Marsh and with Barry Kramer. What could I do? What could anybody do? I ended up writing an incredibly long piece, a long, sprawling piece. I can't even tell you what it was about. But they gave me page after page after page. And finally, the issue that I so eagerly awaited arrived in June of 1971. And all around me were pieces that made me feel incompetent, that made me feel almost mute. And nothing more than Lester Bangs' piece, Psychotic Reactions in Carburetor Dung, one of the greatest pieces of arts writing by anybody about anything since the Second World War. But there was also a long essay by R. Serge Denisov on rock and roll teenage death songs. You know, I thought I had been listening to the radio all through the 50s and 60s and would know everything. No, I didn't know half of what he knew. There was a heartfelt, heart on your sleeve, blood in your mouth column by Dave Marsh about Bob Dylan and the Hawks' performance in Manchester in 1966, long before it had ever been bootlegged as the Royal Albert Hall concert. There was just a tape that was floating around. And then, you know, again, you saw somebody saying, music means more to me than life. Music is life. I don't understand life without music. There was a column, not a column, a long piece by Richard Meltzer about why Muhammad Ali actually won every round in his fight against Joe Frazier, which of course he lost. There were 43 record reviews, a lot of them of multiple albums. There were special columns on 45s, on oldies, on bootlegs, on imports. They must have covered in one way or another over 100 records. It was just endless. It was like it was a 100, 200 page issue. And of course, it wasn't anything near that. And I thought, the chance to have an audience, even if it was only the other writers in the magazine, that would be that strong and that vivid and that dedicated. God, it was the perfect audience. It was the perfect situation for a writer. A magazine that made you want to outdo yourself and do half as well as the people around you. And that all came really from Dave and Lester, but Dave as the moral compass. So I flew out to Detroit to meet these people who were putting out this magazine, to meet Dave and Barry Kramer and D-Day Lorene. Who are these people? And essentially they gave me a guide to Detroit, where I'd never been, made me feel, you know, so naive and so foreign. And here they were, proud of their city, proud of their offices on Woodward Avenue, proud of the bullet holes from the riots of years before that were still there in the wood and the door frame. Proud to go out to dinner at 2 a.m. for all-night restaurants that catered to auto workers just getting off their 8-hour shifts that went 24 hours. It was so exciting. And that followed through in Dave's writing, I think most of all in his book on Louie Louie. That said to me, you could write a book about anything. It was a great subject. No one had quite recognized what a great subject it was. He got all the way into the song, into its history, explained all the mysteries, made it clear this story would never end, and also made the case that this strange song by a nowhere band that takes over the entire country, you know, it was worth as much as anything the music had ever produced, if not more. That was so touching. And I want to talk a little bit about Dave's work with cancer. Of course, he has a personal history, but when Kristen Ankar died, Dave didn't simply mourn, he didn't simply grieve along with Barbara. They said, well, what can we do to make the world better than Kristen Ann left it? And Kristen left it. And not only did they set up a foundation, Dave became a kind of one-person clearinghouse for cancer. Someone who not only learned a lot, but learned how to find out what he and other people didn't know. And so many people over the years, I have no idea how many, when cancer hit them, hit their family, hit them personally, they would turn to Dave, and Dave would open doors, and Dave would provide information, and Dave would make introductions, and Dave would not stop. He didn't have anything else to do. You suddenly became his only priority. That certainly happened in our lives when my wife had breast cancer. He opened the doors at Sloan Kettering. He opened the doors of knowledge. He made it seem as if there were resources. There wasn't only fear and desperation. And as anyone who works with cancer, that means that you have to lose people. And Dave has stood up to that. He has taken that pain into himself and given comfort and succor to so many people. I think that's of a piece with his writing. You turn to Dave, you want to know what somebody really thinks, you're going to find out. Well, I'll stop here. I want to hear what other people have to say.
Thank you, Griel. Thank you so much. I think that we're going to throw it now to Bob Christgau. We can get our camera exchanges going.
Did I make it work?
You did.
Holy shit. Wow. All right. I'm going to read here like it's a lecture. I'm pretty sure it's in the fall of '71. When I was living in North Hollywood and teaching at the just launched California Institute of the Arts and checking in regularly by phone and plane with my good friends, Griel and Jenny up north, that Griel told me Detroit had generated an alternative to the San Francisco-based Rolling Stone called Cream that was edited by a 21-year-old tyro dynamo named Dave Marsh. I was a native New Yorker who was filing rock and roll and columns to the Village Voice from LA and who distrusted Jan Wenner since he opposed the yippie SDS 1968 Chicago action. Griel was the mag's inaugural reviews editor, but he too had political/editorial differences with Wenner by then. That wasn't the only reason we were both ready to welcome Cream. In the early moment, the more rock criticism outlets, the better. But Cream wasn't just an alternative; it was an antidote to everything soft and hippy-dippy about Rolling Stone, as far as I was concerned. I think Griel might have felt a little different. And the main reason was this eager, intense, super bright, open to suggestions kid named Dave Marsh. Sometime that spring, Dave flew to the Bay Area to meet up with Griel and then flew down to LA to say hello to me. This was more than casual. It was inspirational. And Dave, almost as much as in Griel, I felt I'd encountered a rock critic who was interested in everything, who cared deep about this shit. Griel was already on the brink of publishing in Cream, not Rolling Stone, his monumental rock or hula clarified. That's the long piece he's talking about, which he's a little too modest about. Because, though it faded from the collective memory for a while, was discussed for months to come by every rock critic I knew. An analysis and celebration of what Griel all capped as pop, P-O-P, that was most remarkable for how wholeheartedly this straight-talking intellectual identified with a generation then losing its moxie by voicing a defiant political despondency that allowed even the weatherman a certain dark attraction. There were other nascent rock mags around. The newly revived Crawdaddy, the Boston-owned Fusion, the United Artists-supported Phonograph record, the Greg Shaw fanzine, Who Put the Bomb. But none of them combined the fun-friendly, irreverence, deep unconventionality, stealth intellection, and White Panthers adjacent political substratum of Cream. It was Cream that made Rockahula possible and Rockahula that ensconced Cream as the go-to alternative to the rapidly calcifying late or maybe even post-countercultural self-righteousness and complacency of Rolling Stone. And while Dave's hire of Griel find Lester Bangs, I don't understand that sequence, and maybe we'll have to get it right straight. I think I have it wrong. Certainly had something to do with this, and some credit owner-publisher Barry Kramer with a portion of it as well. Dave was clearly the motor. And there's one more thing. What was then slotted soul music? Excuse me. Detroit was also Motown, and no one at Cream felt that more deeply than Dave Marsh. It's inaccurate to assume that rock mags back then ignored black pop. The man who turned out to be Marsh's longtime friend and benefactor, John Landau, was a crawdaddy bro, and also a musician who could break down the mechanics that powered the souls of Wilson Pickett or Levi Stubbs. Rolling Stone certainly had its spell specialists, especially Russell Gersten and James Isaacs, both Bostonites. I expect got some assignments from Landau when he was Rolling Stone's review editor. But Marsh had a passion for this stuff. And although it faded from Cream as the spirit of Lester Bangs took hold, Lester was great, but this was not his bailiwick. It remained a touchstone for Marsh. Not for nothing, and by no means absurdly, as he declared that disco is every bit as important as punk, or renamed Rock and Roll Confidential, Rock and Rap Confidential. Less than a year after Dave and I met, my writing career took a crucial turn. Oft from CalArts, like everybody else in my department, I landed another teaching job at CUNY's Richmond College while continuing to turn out rock and roll and essays and consumer guides at The Voice that may have raised my piece rate from $40, I don't remember, but certainly not by much. It might have been 60 by the end. But then that winter, the Long Island Daily Newsday offered me its newly created rock critic slot, which more than doubled my income into the low 20,000s. The only drawback was that Newsday had no slot for the consumer guide, which after its mid-69 startup had become my critical signature. But Dave came to the rescue. I published capsule reviews in Newsday, then I'd compile them into consumer guides published in Cream. After I returned to The Voice as music editor in 1974, the deal continued to my immense benefit. And I don't just mean financial. I didn't get paid that much by Cream and didn't care. It gained me a nationwide audience of brainy weirdos. Not most Cream readers, I assume, but a lot of them in cults and covens and, you betcha, lonely bedrooms far from New York City, some of whom subscribe to my Substack newsletter today. And somewhere in there, he also hired my sister Georgia Christgau and our cartoonist boyfriend, Wes Goodwin, for their first journalism jobs, which eventually led both of them back to the Village Voice. In 1973, I had a chance to give back. My Newsday job was a good one, but I hadn't given up on my 60s dreams. Over 20 grand? Nice. But I didn't need all that money. I lived in a 4-bedroom apartment east of Avenue B that cost me $57 a month. And I just hooked up with the woman who's my wife today. So I had a brainstorm. I'd work half a year and pursue other literary ventures in the other half. After, that is, I undertook a long cross-country journey with the love of my life before it was too late, which I was right to intuit might be soon. I never did such a thing again. What's more, I know this very smart young guy in Detroit who could handle a Newsday job fine. Incredibly, Newsday went for it. Dave moved to New York, as he'd been hankering to do, and on or about July 1st, 1973, as Carol and I commenced a car trip that ended in October, Dave not only took over my Newsday job, but moved into our $57 a month apartment. He did fine in both positions, but Newsday said no mas. They wanted one full-time rock critic, which for a while, Dave Marsh became. When Clay Felker's newly purchased Village Voice proffered me a salary cut of $9,000 to become the music editor. So pretty soon, Marsh got an offer he couldn't refuse and moved to Boston to become the music editor of the real paper there. Dave's time in Boston had one enormously important musical consequence. It was he who persuaded Bostonite John Landau to go see this Bruce Springsteen guy And while it's a little hard to believe that Bruce's evolution into Bruce wasn't inevitable, don't underestimate the significance of this coincidence. Anointing Bruce Springsteen rock and roll future gets all the ink, but raves don't sell records. Bruce Springsteen was embroiled with a manager named Mike Apple, and as Dave's 2004 Springsteen biography makes amply clear, with fairness to all parties, it was Landau who not only produced Born to Run, no small thing, but extricated Springsteen from Appel's clutches. But Boston was a serious college town, and even worse, a collegiate Bohemia, almost the un-Detroit. And Dave was never comfortable there. Soon he was back in New York, writing for the Anti-Cream at Rolling Stone, and also falling for the love of his life, Barbara Carr, who soon became John Landau's right-hand woman, and who, unless she's finally retired, because I don't keep up, remains that woman to this day. As it happens, my reservations about Born to Run always instill an A album by me, though perhaps not an A+. Quoting Griel Marcus, I compared Bruce to musical comedy belter Howard Keel, and while I know there was more to it than that, I've always believed that stung more hurtfully than was wise. Seemed to initiate a cooling of relations between Dave and me. We remained cordial. I worked with him on various projects and shook hands with Bruce at his wedding reception. But no way would he ever be my subletter, even after we'd moved to 2nd Avenue and he'd moved to, and not just because he'd moved to 57th Street himself. His stay in Boston had intensified his aversion to collegiate types, and especially Bohemians, just as Bohemians were claiming rock and roll under the banner of punk, nowhere more than in the Bohemian paper of record, the Village Voice. Sometimes he pissed me off at a distance, you bet. But I no longer remember those incidents. What I do keep in mind is two things. The first is Rock and Roll Confidential, now in a token of his continuing devotion to Black music and also of simple justice, Rock and Rap Confidential. Dave was always class conscious, which is a fireman's son and proud union man, so am I. But White Panthers and no White Panthers at Cream, the politics often got muted. So the way his radicalism flowered and intensified, just as the American left was entering a tailspin, was and remains inspirational. So I'm a leftist and work to make the Voice more that way in my 32 years there. Sometimes it's always needed more than mere liberals, not to mention the bad guys, believe. I don't always agree with him on the issues. He's further left than I am. But that he should use his considerable success as a writer and DJ to promulgate leftist ideologies in many respects is his most impressive achievement. And then there's one other thing I want to mention, and that's his books, and that I don't have written, so at least I'll be talking directly to you. Griel mentioned the Louie Louie book. It's a great book. I'm also especially pleased, though I don't think it's quite a great book, that Dave had the chutzpah to write a whole book about the Beatles' second album, which he and I agree is the greatest Beatles album, even though it's an American Beatles album, and that therefore not in the canon at all, because it has all those R&B covers on it. But most of all, I want to praise the heart of rock and soul. 2015, Dave told me he wasn't even sure he knew why he wrote this book. It's a great book. And why I talked to him about it in 2015 is that I was teaching a course on the 50s when assembling any kind of a syllabus proved far more difficult than I thought it would be. The Heart of Rock and Souls, which offers 1,001 reviews of pieces about singles, which do not unfortunately include the Ramones' Rockaway Beach. He wrote what was all over my syllabus. For my syllabus, he wrote about Fats Domino, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Gene Vincent, and the heavenly chorus of doo-wop records by the Orioles, the Drifters, the Penguins, the Five Satins, the Platters, Jesse Belvin, the Del Vikings, the Monotones, the Diamonds, the Silhouettes, Morris Williams and the Zodiacs, the Flamingos, the Marcells, Shep and the Limelights, and the Drifters. I mean, that music is disgracefully almost forgotten. And Dave did all of that and plenty more, because I could go on with other things that he wrote about that were in this in my course, which I could not have done without him. It is the best writing on the 50s that anybody has done, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's probably enough right now. Sorry if I was looking at my notes. I'm a newcomer to Zoom. I can see that's not a good way to do things. But I look forward to hearing what Anne and Greg have to say.
Thank you, Bob. Greg, I think you're up. So Bob, if you want
So now I have to
to
mute
do the
screen.
camera switch off, hand it to Mr. Tate.
All right. So unlike my compadres here, I don't know Dave Marsh. And unless I'm having a senior moment, I don't think I've ever even met Dave Marsh. But I was a teen reader of Cream in Washington, D.C. in the 70s. And it introduced me to the funkiest journalist who ever wrote, Vernon Gibbs. And I remember reading about Funkadelic in Cream in particular. And so I know that the impact of Dave Marsh, kind of seeped into my critical consciousness early on, long before I'd even thought about being a critic for a living. When Vernon Reid and myself and some other stalwarts started the Black Rock Coalition in 1985, we were very aware that we were forming a kind of counter movement against a white rock coalition. Kind of that coterie of guys, white guys in the business who did A&R, who did radio programming, who did concert promotion, and critics. And we very much saw them as kind of representing what we called, kind of a white nationalist agenda in music around what was becoming a kind of hateful term in our eyes, that of rock, as it represented a kind of white male dominion, and a few others allowed in. And we talked about apartheid-oriented radio and apartheid-oriented rock, and knowing and reading Marsh's work, and knowing that he, as a son of the D, Detroit, had a whole other kind of respect and recognition of Black music. And, part of that recognition is about understanding the history of the terminology, knowing that at one point in time, rhythm and blues and rock and roll were synonymous. It's great going back and looking at concert bills from the 50s and just seeing the range of artists, who would be at the same shows under either name, R&B or rock and roll. But, as Griel has pointed out, rock and roll became rock in the 60s. And it kind of started to, well, it didn't kind of, it began to delimit the notion of who could be a rock artist, and so, you have this whole emergence of a whole kind of cultural Gestapo in place that kind of denied all these Black artists, who were as influenced by the Beatles as James Brown and Sly Stone and Jimmy, but denied a place on rock FM radio, and denied a place in Rolling Stone and as rock artists. And Cream was certainly a leader in terms of combating that. Everybody on this panel, I have to acknowledge in this time when people are talking about wokeness and allies and accomplices, that are not people who are in the category of the suddenly awakened to the primacy and the potency of Black culture in America, and have long been folks who got it and who we, in terms of my Black Rock Coalition family, have understood as fellow fighters in the in the movement towards justice through music. And Dave Marsh certainly represents that kind of person, that kind of figure, that kind of leader in the field. And quite frankly, the kind of person who, because of his push to see the critical conversation be democratized and inclusive and incredibly diverse, made the field welcome for people like myself and Nelson George and Barry Michael Cooper, and Carol Cooper, Dream Hampton and other folks. And his decision to change the name from Rock and Roll Confidential to Rock and Rap Confidential was just one of the great interventions in the changing of the narrative, and I don't know to what degree he influenced or had a direct hand in the programming at the actual Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but I was just gobsmacked, shocked, pleasantly surprised when I walked in that building and saw that the kind of democracy, the kind of ecumenical representation of the real story of American music, of Black music, of rock, and rock and roll was contained in that space, and in the juxtapositions that kind of leveled all the white nationalist propaganda that was kind of coming out of the White Rock Coalition. And so hail, Dave Marsh, for all of that. Now, I just want to take this moment to also do my own kind of a critical pushback on Dave, because now, I read, he thinks of John Bonham as a failure, as a rock drummer, but then I feel the need to mention that John Bonham is one of the most sampled drummers in the history of breakbeat music, of hip hop music. He's a funky drummer. He's not the funky drummer, but he's been sampled about 400 times. And then he also had an issue with Queen as being what he called an elitist band. And I was thinking, well, Freddie Mercury is kind of our first Afro-Asiatic immigrant rock superstar. So, he kind of represents, kind of an elitist insurgency from below. And I'll just throw in this last tidbit about Journey, another Blanc Noir, or Bet Blanc, I guess, right? Because I know that when Jay-Z wanted to learn song form, that's who he studied. So, I felt like, hey, a critics panel, why not, do some critical pushback too, in addition to all the praise singing that one must do of Mr. Dave Marsh. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. And I'm sure Dave would appreciate all the pushback we can muster in his typical way. Throwing it to my dear friend Ann Powers.
Hello, everyone. Well, of course, since I'm going last, I have been somewhat, what's the word? Not usurped, but just a little bit of what I was going to talk about has been talked about before. So bear with me. I do also have words to read. First of all, before I start, I just want to say it's an honor and a pleasure to be with my friends, mentors, heroes on this panel, each of whom are so important in my own history and development, Bob, Griel, and Greg. So I also, like Greg, never really knew Dave, have never hung out with him a lot, always enjoyed when we would run across each other on panels, but we're not close friends. And I love to hear the Cream stories, the personal stories that Bob and Griel have shared, but I'm coming at his work as a reader. And because our time for comments is limited, and I especially going last, I'm going to focus on one book, a book that Bob mentioned, Dave's Manifesto on the True Value and True Values of Rock and Roll, 1989's The Heart of Rock and Soul, the 1001 Greatest Singles Ever Made. Okay, so first off, this book is great on the surface level. Dave makes a killer list, one that ranges from rock's earliest days to the time of this publication, but which, as Bob and Greg mentioned, really puts the emphasis on Black progenitors of the rock era. And I very much agree with Bob that 50s music is criminally overlooked at this time, and actually always has been in terms of like critical inquiry. And this book is so valuable in that way. At the top of Dave's list is Marvin Gaye's I Heard It Through the Grapevine, a choice that may be surprising to some, given Gaye's more quote unquote highbrow singles of the What's Going On era and later, but which Marsh argues belongs at the top because it's accessible and complex, a work of art and a basic conversation about love, loss, and difficult emotions. It's a song everybody knows. The 1001th song in the book is No Way Out by Joyce Harris, a bit of gothic R&B that Dave explains became a favorite mystery to him and his friends Michael Goodwin and Griel Marcus, who spent many pre-internet years trying to track down its origins. A great frame. Those two songs create a great frame, a song everyone knows, a song nobody knew. In between, as Bob mentioned, were doo-wop and 70s rock, Minneapolis soul and Bakersfield country, Rapper's Delight and Soul Makossa, Peter Gabriel and Chaka Khan. You could argue that there weren't enough women in the top tiers, I would, but hey, as Greg just pointed out, what are lists? What is rock writing? What is music writing but grounds for arguments? Debating this book would take you everywhere. I'm as interested in Marsh's framing arguments as I am in the list itself. In his introduction, he writes that rock criticism's focus on albums, fully enforced by the late 80s and reinforced, in fact, by the rise of indie rock, which my Gen X peers and I definitely wrote a lot about, had left him feeling, quote, out of sync with myself. Marsh's personal values included catchiness, sexiness, and connection and community, all of which he heard foregrounded in singles and not necessarily in the same way in the album listening experience. Now I'm going to go off script and just say, I think when you look at Rock and Roll Consumer Guide, what Bob has done for so many years, that great legacy, in conversation with Dave, I think they share a lot of values, but I'd love to hear, Bob, I'd love to hear what you have to say about your focus on the album in relation to Dave's focus on the single in this book. The very use of the term rock and soul in the title of this book was a necessary blow against the evolutionary narrative that had more sophisticated rock growing out of wild but primitive R&B, and also placed Black musical production from the 60s into the 80s on the same level and in dialogue with white hitmakers. I use the term rock and soul habitually now to refer to music of the 60s that is rock and soul, and I like it better than rock and roll personally, or just rock. Still, I can't think of a better term to ground a reconsideration of music writing itself. And today, especially in 2021, I think scholars are making great interventions that deliberately are not following the footsteps of Dave's writing. Writers like Maureen Mann and Daphne Brooks, who are now enacting these changes by celebrating the careers of music writers who have been overlooked, like Phil Garland and Cynthia Dagnall Myron, and pointing out the key aspects of music making that rock publications, Rolling Stone, for example, often de-emphasized: vocals, novelty, collaboration, all the things Marsh repositioned at his argument's center. Marsh also values sex and the expression of eroticism. Of course, I, who wrote a book about sexuality and music, love this about the heart and rock and soul. His frankness may have taken and may still take some readers aback, as it also did in his classic Stranded essay from the book, that the great collection Stranded. His essay was on masturbation songs called Onan's Greatest Hits. But for me, Dave's writing on sex is a template, along with Bob's writing, on how to be honest and personal and accurate about sex in music. I'd like to just read two examples. The first is about his number 18 single, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman by Aretha Franklin. Dave writes, A Natural Woman is probably the greatest record ever made about female sexuality. Imagine, a woman sits at her windowsill on a rainy morning. She feels pretty good about herself, and that's something new. Her guy is the reason. Why? Well, you can only tell between the lines from the metaphor she uses. She'd never say it out loud, but the most sensible guess is that she's finally found someone with whom she can achieve orgasm. So she sings her song of ecstasy. And if that's not it, you better have a pretty damn plausible alternative explanation for these lines. Oh, baby, what you done to me. You make me feel so good inside. And I just want to be close to you. You make me feel so alive. A natural woman inverts respect, but in no way is it about being dependent. It's about the near delirious experience of being fully equal, which is as close to a definition of good sex as I'd care to venture. In these days of feminist vigilance, endorsing a song in which a woman declares her devotion to a man by thanking him for helping to fulfill her, quote, nature is risky stuff. But that's not all that's going on here. This music is also about as beautiful and moving as you can imagine. Strings skidding against drums, horns rising to announce passion that's so fully carnal that is practically radioactive. It's beautiful writing and admirable writing, especially from a cishet man about women's sexuality. I just want to give one other brief example. I won't read the whole entry, but he also was not afraid to talk about male sexuality. In number 396, he writes of Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel, the greatest ode any man has ever written to the potential potency of his own penis. This much everyone can understand, whether or not they would know what the hell a fruit cage is, let alone fathom why anybody would want to be in anybody else's. So Dave was not afraid of writing about sex, and he writes about it beautifully in this book, throughout this book. He also pioneered, in many ways, the use of memoir in music writing, which is so overwhelmingly popular today. His entry on You Lost That Love and Feeling, number 5 on his list, I won't read the whole thing, but I just go read the first paragraph and then you can go find it. The radio on my boyhood dresser was an old tabletop model with tubes. The top was cracked and at high volume. The busted brown plastic made it screech. My father got it when my great aunt died, but it looked the kind of thing you'd pick up at a junkyard. It was the greatest treasure he ever gave me. But he went on to express listening to this radio and hearing the song, You've Lost That Love and Feeling. The whole thing is a beautiful memoir that really gets at the heart of listening, which is, of course, the beginning of all music writing. And I so appreciate this book for that. I think maybe my comments bring together two important points made in this panel. One, that Dave has always been vociferously a champion of equal rights in music writing and of viewing music outside of the segregationist categories formed by the music industry and too often the music press. And also he's just a great writer. I'll just conclude by saying in 1989, the heart of rock and soul was a daring statement in many ways. My own white Generation X peers were busy fetishizing the album, and the split between writing about rock and writing about everything else, which by the mid-90s would result in separate glossy magazines dedicated to alternative rock, spin, and hip hop vibe, encouraged the worst segregationist impulses of American music culture. In the age of streaming, of post-genres, of Gen Z's, third culture rainbow kids, we can now see how Dave Marsh's work was prescient. I'm very happy it's existed to be a guide for me and for many others. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And everybody can turn their cameras back on now and we can just kind of talk. And I think, Anne, you ended at maybe a perfect spot for us all to kind of talk together, as you always do. Let's see if we can get Griel and Greg back on. It would be more fun if we were together, but this will work.
It's not letting me turn my video back on. It's supposed to unlock me, unleash me.
Eric, do you have Greg's camera off?
Greg's wearing the coolest shades I've ever seen, the coolest eyeglasses. So we need to
Yeah, I'm blocked too.
All right, Eric.
I'm trying back here.
Okay, you'll be there in a minute. And I'm wondering about there's Griel. Hey everybody, thank you. That was amazing. as you talked about that last kind of generational shift, I mean, Dave's work has not been kind of championed, I think, by some subsequent generations in the way that, say, yours is, Bob, or yours has been, Griel. I mean, if we think about kind of who we might hear quoted over at the PopCon for years, it would probably wouldn't be much Dave. And I've been thinking about why that might be. And that seems to me to bring together a few issues. One is Dave's sort of anti-bohemianism and deep engagement kind of with the 50s. I think what Anne, you've said, and Bob, it's really important to note that there's just not as much good stuff on the 50s as we really need. But I guess I'd just throw that question to start out in terms of just maybe where rock criticism went kind of
Can I
after
say one thing
rock
that's
and-
sort of half off the topic, but I really
Yeah.
think ought to be mentioned here somewhere? Wondering exactly what Dave's years at the Real Paper and so forth were. I went to his Wikipedia entry. It's a disgrace. It's a slam job. And if anybody out there has any way of putting in something better about Dave Marsh in Wikipedia, it's terrible. It's just awful. I think he basically, whoever wrote it, quotes some of Dave's more outrageous statements. I don't remember what they were, in which he didn't worship Bob Dylan, and I don't fucking know. But it was, I mean, I was appalled. I was truly appalled. And somebody ought to fix that. It's bad. It'll make a difference in I would think, his own reputation, and that ought to be repaired.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Look, my Wikipedia said I wrote a book I never wrote, and it took me years to fix it. So anybody out there able to fix Wiki, I agree. help a writer out. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think possibly the trajectory of Dave's career is one reason. His close alliance with one of the greatest rock stars of all time, but that sort of like, brought him behind the scenes to a certain extent. I love, Greg, what you said about Rock and Rap Confidential. I mean, think of how pioneering it was to have a newsletter. Now everybody is like clamoring to have a newsletter, but again, he was working in these different ways that weren't the conventional ways, even as he was writing books and working in more conventional ways too. But maybe just like the path he took. So much of reputation is about where your work stands, where you're seen. I mean, he was certainly an irascible guy in the 90s. I guess this is the point where I bring up that one reason I never really knew Dave was because I heard through the grapevine, maybe it was through you, Bob, that he once said that my writing stood for everything he hated in music writing. And
I can see how you would remember that more readily than me. But on the other hand, I didn't talk to Dave often enough to even hear that sort of thing. So I don't know.
Who knows? It might have just been gossip. But, I mean, I think he was a challenging personality at times. So maybe that's why. I mean, when you think about reputation, personality also makes a difference. But focusing on the work, I mean, I think it's ripe for revival now, especially since it fills in some of the major gaps.
Well, the fact of the matter is that he hasn't written that much criticism in the last 30 years. Yeah. I don't read Rock and Rap Confidential, but for the most part, that isn't what it does. It makes political connections, which, as I said, I think is a tremendous endeavor, but isn't liable to make him more quotable in the music writing world. I think in 2015 you could buy The Heart of Rock and Soul for a penny at Amazon. I don't know. I didn't check when I was looking this stuff up again. But The Heart of Rock and Soul is a great book. I haven't. Which is not to say I've read it through at every page. And it's not that kind of book. But it's not that it's never true that there's nothing that Dave says that you don't disagree with. That's not what it's about either. But just as it's a true achievement, and it is true that when I was doing that course, I could not have done that course without Dave's book. That's how important I think it is, and it deserves some sort of a revival. That's as much as I can say. I mean, but it is also true, Anne. You know that what is there a collection? Did he do? Yes, he did do one collection.
There's one from 1985, Fortunate Son.
That's right. Well, I haven't looked at that in a while. Yeah, it's on one of my high. When you get to be 79, there are certain books that you really don't want to read because you risk bodily harm to get them, and that's in that category. Yeah, that's right. It's all the way up there, huh? Yeah, but I mean, I'd be interested. I mean, could he do another book? I don't know. I don't know how much writing there is there.
Yeah, Lauren, I'd venture to say that one reason he didn't have the impact on the next generation is because he didn't write for The Voice or Rolling Stone in the 80s and 90s. Because
I don't know.
I have friends who have made whole careers out of two pieces that got published in The Voice late 80s. You know what I mean? I mean, people have magazines. They've been able to start magazines. They have academic careers. Like movie writing careers got launched out of Village Voice pieces. So I mean, and I mean, just in terms of those platforms are what really put a lot of us on the map for the next, for our generation of readers and for the next generation of critics and academics.
Well, I'd also say one other thing, which is that I think Dave's anti-bohemianism is fucked up, period, and almost guarantees that the kind of people who read rock criticism are not going to be interested in him, because that's bohemians of one sort or another, ex-bohemians, fringe bohemians, whatever. That's who does this. Arty people read this stuff. There are kind of arty people. There are plenty of arty people I loathe. These guys, these are my people, and there's literally hundreds of thousands of them. But Dave doesn't write for them.
Well, that's a good point. My first book was called Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America. So maybe that's why he didn't like me.
Well, I think he'd have stuff that would appeal to bohemians, but not framed the way it is, and I mean, that's certainly been a really consistent stance in his work, and also anything smelling at all of academia is quick to, I can still piss Dave off by going down that road. So I'm sure that kind of lingers. There was one historical thing, Bob, you were trying to figure out, kind of maybe back and forth with Griel, about a sort of sequence of Cream and you and Griel. I don't know whether that's worth figuring out.
Griel, did not send Lester to Cream? Cream got there on his own?
Have to wait a second.
Okay. The other part of Dave's work that I'm sort of interested in this particular moment is a lot of the anti-censorship work. That, I would say for me as a reader,
he's really
calling bullshit on the censorship of rock.
And sort of stubborn about that particular issue. I mean, I can tell you, I give my little bit of year-end charitable giving. Part of it is through stuff that gets to me through Dave, and that's one of the anti-censorship stuff is one of them. He's great about that.
Okay, what was the question? I had to answer the door.
Did you think that Lester was there when you discovered Cream? You didn't send Lester to Cream?
Did I send Lester to Cream?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Well, I was always my impression that was how it happened, but I could very well be wrong.
Possible, because Lester wrote this remarkable piece where his girlfriend was singing in the band at a prom. And so Lester went to the prom, and he went around and talked to everybody there, all the high school students, and talked to the people in the band. And at one point, someone said, "What are you doing here? Why have you got this notebook?" And he said, well, I'm covering this prom for Rolling Stone, and I just love that concept. I'm covering this prom for Rolling Stone. Well, Rolling Stone wouldn't publish the piece, which I tried to get them to do. So it could have been that at that point I said, Lester, send it to Cream. I think Dave Marsh will publish this. But that doesn't jibe with my memory of being so shocked at of Poppin' Pies and Fun, Lester's breakthrough piece, I think, in Cream at the end of 1970. But who knows, I can't put it all back together.
Maybe DeRogatis has the sequence right, and maybe he doesn't. But he's a pretty good reporter, whatever his other limitations.
In terms of Dave's audience and all this business about bohemianism, this isn't who Dave wanted to reach, Right. Dave always wanted to reach people who came out of the backgrounds, if not the same, comparable to his. Backgrounds essentially of intellectual deprivation, where people had to educate themselves. They didn't have access to, maybe the kind of intellectual stimulation, intellectual contextualization that other people had. Dave didn't graduate from college. He was an autodidact, and as great an autodidact as I've ever encountered. Someone who made himself a true scholar of all kinds of realms. And so Dave wanted to meet people.
You're right.
Griel, I think your mic might be covered.
Yeah, could be.
There you go.
Wherever it is. So I don't think Dave was necessarily interested in reaching that audience, whatever that audience is. Not that he didn't want to reach anybody or anyone. Like any writer, you want to be read. You want to be surprised by what people who've read you have to say to you about what you know, about what you didn't know, what you taught them, where you fell short. And he got that.
I wonder if any of y'all think that, like, the Detroit Midwestern roots of what Dave did had any effect, because, like, Greg, what you were saying about the voice connection rings so true for me as someone who started on the West Coast but needed to kind of come to the Mecca, to get noticed nationally. I wonder.
As Bob knows, I started writing for the paper from DC. So, but it was the venue, but it was also like, we got to experience this moment, at the Voice and then at the Source and Vibe, where it's like what critics said mattered. It mattered for the first time to artists, I think, in a major way. Like, everybody knows the infamous stories about, people wanting to beat up writers at the Source because they got two mics.
Right.
So it was just such a unique moment in terms of music criticism, having this kind of instant feedback impact, and potency, in the culture, And, like I said, Barry, Nelson, Dream, they all launched film careers out of writing for the Voice, man. So, it was just, I think missing that moment just, it had an impact on how the work is received, work got received, because it was so much about like the fire that got ignited in the moment.
Yeah.
And everybody's head was really hot. The music that was coming out and the politics that was surrounding it. It was in some ways, a lot of his stances, kind of set up, the moment, and the just bridging activism, serious criticism, scholarship, being reflective about things as they were happening, in the culture. And and not being afraid to be, a wise asshole, about particularly like white rock coalition favorites. You know what I mean? Yeah, so,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, it's like, I think if Dave had been in the voice in that moment, I mean, the younger folks would be talking about it now. I mean, as you say, it's time for kind of a regeneration, a reclamation, or reflection on his work, because I think given who a lot of like who younger people are trying to be now, they're really, he's such a great model, for kind of doing it all.
It's so true.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, it's like, I
There's
don't know.
a DIY thing happening,
Did he invent poptimism? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm thinking too about that. Greg, you mentioned it about sort of the relationship between the critic and the artist. When I think about Dave's work, I mean, most obviously Springsteen, for which he's taken a lot of flack. Barbara being one of Bruce's managers, et cetera. But I think Dave has gotten close to a lot of artists. And I just wondered how you all have kind of navigated that yourself in your career and your work. Because it does, right? It's always in the game when you're trying to write about the music. You've got to address it, no?
Well, I just want to say with the Springsteen thing, it reminds me of there's a friend of mine who was married to a very well-known Black scholar, and when they got divorced, she kept the name, and she said, "Yeah, because I built that brand." So when I think about David Springsteen, I mean, there's some of that sense of recognition of self in there too. It's like, yeah. Anyway, but
the closest analogy I can think of to Dave and Bruce is Stanley Crouch and Wynton Marsalis. And I don't think that in itself, did that make Stanley Crouch not a good critic about other things? Well, it certainly.
Do we really want to go there?
No, no, Greg. I mean, the answer is, as far as I'm concerned, no. Yeah, Stanley had shared with Wynton what I regard as a neoconservative aesthetic, which I don't have much sympathy with. But that doesn't mean it ruined him as a critic. It made him a certain kind of critic.
But he became a neoconservative after somebody who was the champion of the Black Bohemian avant-garde, for the first half of his career. So,
All right, let's leave that be then.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, I don't. But
Go ahead, Greg.
I mean, I agree with you that is like the kind of the best analogy. I mean, it's something that only a particular moment in history would even have allowed for, in terms of the place that rock criticism was taken in the culture, its ability to like make careers, make opinion, and to give an artist like Springsteen a gravitas that it may have taken him several albums, down the road to achieve, Yeah.
Springsteen's a very special case.
Yeah.
Because basically, he was pretty much as good as John Landau thought he was. Nobody can quite be that good, but on the other hand, John wasn't going that big with it. He just was looking for the right piece of rhetoric. And Springsteen has proven to be good politically, willing to take chances, remarkably fruitful into his 60s, although I do think he's kind of wearing out here. And so it's really okay, but that doesn't have to. So what should Dave have done? I mean, I think maybe Dave didn't really want to be a critic as much as he wanted to be a writer, and maybe he was as interested in politics as he was in music. Certainly his charitable work and all that stuff, he didn't have to do that, except that his wife was making good money, so he didn't have to worry about that part of it. And, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think the books are indispensable. You know, it's just a question of who reads kind of rock scholarship, you know.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Black rockers, I mean, he contributed to indispensable books in the canon, the oral history of P-Funk and the oral history of Sly and the Family Stone. You know what I mean? Like,
I would add to that, Greg, the one on Sam Moore, Sam and Dave.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to interject a couple of things. One is I never lived in New York when I wrote for the Village Voice, so I don't know what kind of chatter pieces in the Voice produced. I don't know what kind of impact they had in New York City. But I think, you know, I don't, it's not anything was ever part of my life or anything I ever cared about. You know, what will people in New York think of this? What will they be talking about? Never occurred to me. We have to remember that Dave and other people, but Dave primarily started a music magazine in Detroit when nobody cared about Detroit, when nobody took Detroit seriously, when nobody thought there was anything there. And it was patriotic to its city, it was patriotic to Michigan, it was patriotic to a sensibility that they believed they had and other people didn't. It was embattled, it was defiant, it was, you think we're dirt and we're not. And that, you know, I talked at the beginning about how I thought at Cream that Dave's great accomplishment was to create a field of freedom for himself and for other writers. And I think that after he left Cream as a journalist, until he started Rock and Roll Confidential, he was searching for a place of freedom, whether it was at the Real Paper, whether it was at Rolling Stone or anywhere else, and he didn't find it. So maybe that's why he turned to books. But we have to remember that New York is not the center of the universe, and it's definitely not the center of the universe for people who, from all other places, who want to make themselves heard and enter into a cultural conversation. And the second thing I want to mention is Ed Ward, who died this week. And when I went through that issue of Cream of June 1971, where I first wrote there, Ed was already there. Ed was already contributing reviews to Cream. Ed was in a lot of places before any of us. He was writing for Broadside magazine, the New York City protest song magazine, when he was 16 years old. He was writing for Crawdaddy long before I ever wrote for anybody, and other people too. Ed had, as somebody put it to me today, a life of burning bridges. Well, that's true. There's no question about it. But I want to mention on this day dedicated to Dave, Ed too.
Griel, I'm glad you made both of those comments. First of all, I think it was a good corrective to my comment, because I wasn't intending to say, oh, you have, of all people, I would never want to say New York was the center of the universe, being from Seattle and from the West Coast, of course. As you know, starting my career there, since you were a great mentor to me when I was in San Francisco. So thank you for that. And also, I'm glad you mentioned Ed, because I don't know, like, how to say this in the right way, but I do feel like we have to recognize ageism as part of the story of who gets remembered and forgotten. And I know Ed suffered, he was still putting out books to the end of his life, and they weren't necessarily getting the same attention. unfortunately, cultural writing often, it should be intergenerational. And I think in the academy, it is more so. And all of our work, luckily, has been embraced to, in different ways and argued about by younger generations. And that's important. But I think for many culture writers, it's hard for their legacies to endure because they're not in the academy, because there's no formal way to show that work still matters. And it's really unfair. It's that's why every attempt to, how do I say this? Like, I think Dave's spirit is anti-institutional, yet I think we have to think about, what institutions exist. And that's why this conference is great, to preserve and communicate the legacies and the current work of older writers as well.
And,
or anything.
No. And when you said that, Anne, too, I was thinking about mentoring and how to create intergenerational relationships too. Somebody in the comments section wasn't asking a question, but had said that Dave was generously mentored generations. It's hard to say together of music writers, but the question is, where can that be happening now? And I know you do a lot of that, Anne.
Oh, I tried. I can't. I want to make one more comment because of what Bob, I think it was, who was saying about Dave's anti-censorship work. And I just want to say, right now we're living in a strange political moment where freedom of speech has become aligned with the right. And I worry that people forget that in the 80s, freedom of speech was aligned with the left. It was aligned with progressive radical people. There was there were artists who were being, their funding was being taken away because they were doing work about sexuality and race and gender. Artists like Andre Serrano and Karen Finley, the Robert Mapplethorpe scandal at the Cincinnati Museum when they took his photographs down. And as with everything, I always want to say, know your history and know that work that Dave did was so important, standing up for marginalized people. And we forget, right now, it seems like people are forgetting that was the heart of the debate over freedom of speech at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point, Anne.
It's interesting because the writers also now suddenly decided that the greatest threat to their ideology is critical race theory.
Right.
So race theorizing as opposed to race mixing.
Right.
It's become the freedom of speech hot button issue.
Right. I live in Tennessee where that was just approved by the legislature. So.
Yeah.
We got one question that might be a fun place to wrap up, and Greg, it echoes what you were saying about Queen and John Bonham. Somebody asked, where have you disagreed with Dave the most about artists? I've blasted him about many artists, and he always says, well, music falls on our ears differently. Any fun arguments that you've had about an artist, or maybe not so fun?
Well, I can tell you that when I was writing Lipstick Traces, which was a book about essentially the avant-garde in Europe and England, that Dave felt that I was, well, let's put it bluntly, I was being unpatriotic. I had turned my back on my own country in an hour of need and crisis. And that's absolutely true. That's exactly what I did. So we had some bitter disagreements about that.
In essentially the whole Reagan era, right? Griel, that period.
Yes, that book was written from 1980 to 1988. Definitely a Reagan book.
Bob, what about you? I'm curious. I never had personal beef with Dave.
You mentioned Bob Dylan earlier, Bob.
What?
You mentioned Bob Dylan earlier as somebody you had.
Did you and Dave argue about Dylan, Bob?
Not that I recall. I mean, look, there was a real bifurcation in my relationship with Dave. Around 76 or so, we had been very good friends, intimate friends, and we weren't anymore. And that doesn't mean we've been feuding. I visited his house. We had various kinds of projects that we were doing together. I don't remember exactly what they were, but they were meaningful. But it did not. Dave came to my 50s class for the doo-wop week. And at a certain point, I used the word, I think it probably was conservative, about some of his tastes in music. That was it. It was over. He didn't actually walk out of the room, but he was so pissed that, although, yeah, I mean, it wasn't like he just wouldn't speak, but there was a chill between us that lasted for the rest of that time, because I had used, and there are definitely senses in which Dave's tastes are conservative. And that's the reason he thought that what Griel was doing was unpatriotic. He doesn't have any interest in that stuff. And that's not a virtue. I mean, it's okay. You like what you like. I always say that about everybody. You like what you like. That's okay. But it's not as if that's a virtue in a critic to basically regard all avant-gardism as a crock of shit. I mean, which I think he basically does. Not a virtue.
I just want to make a side comment that I reliably know. I know my taste because whenever I love something, within like 2 days, I'll find out that Bob hates it. And we're friends, so you can't have arguments.
Absolutely. I really don't expect my friends to like the same music I do, though it's nice when they do because I can play it for them. But no, I mean, that's absolutely right.
Oh my gosh.
Recent thing, and I was like, I can't remember what it was, but it was something I just like in my head was like, I love this thing, and then I was talking to you about, you're like, I hate this. I can't remember what it was though, but it's good to disagree.
It's happened a number of times, and for you to remember the specific example is really would be asking a lot of you.
I'll end on this goofy, funny story. It has nothing to do about taste, just about sort of maybe about mentorship and kind of remembering that sometimes when maybe a young person or somebody who's a rookie at something approaches you, they may be approaching with a lot of fear or nerves or something, because you are, and this is true of all of you, you're big deals. And I was working at Pantheon when the second Springsteen book came out, and I was with Dave on the subway and a couple of other people from Pantheon going to the book party somewhere downtown. And I had been reading Dave since I was 12 or 13, and I was a Springsteen fan too. So the dedication of the book, he dedicates to his daughters and then says, take a good look around, which like pretty obviously in the context of the book is a quote from Springsteen's My Hometown. But I'm just like, I'm nervous because it's Dave and I've not really talked to him before, and I'm a fan and I want to talk to him about my writing. And I somehow think it's from the Beatles' Martha, My Dear, which would make no sense. And I could see it right now. We're on the subway and Dave says, you think I would dedicate a song to my daughters about a dog? And I was just, like, oh, fuck, I blew my chance. But he was very kind to me as a result. But he made it clear, like, that was stupid. And took care of me ever since. Speaking of Dave's daughters, I just want to plug one more time the Kristen Ann Carr Fund. We've been talking about it all through this conference. This conference is free, and those of us who put it together, it's been done on a volunteer basis. But if you're feeling an interest in supporting it, it's dropped in the Q&A. The Kristen Ann Carr Fund to support work for sarcoma cancer research that Dave and Barbara set up a number of years ago, a long time ago now. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Griel, for being part of this and being so generous with your time.
Thank you, Lauren.
You've really
Thank you, Anne.
situated this really well.
Great to see you, Bob, Ann, and Griel. You know,
Yeah.
That was amazing.
Everybody.
Wish we could all go out to dinner now.
Right.
know.
Except that we're all in different cities. Well, no.
Yeah.
I just want to close. And you know, I guess no one got the chance in the Q&A to be I have more of a comment than a question, asshole, but I guess I'll be that guy, which is, you know, regarding Dave's writing in the 90s and early 2000s. You know, he wrote prolifically, in addition for the newsletter, for websites like Addicted to Noise. You know, back before the internet was the center of music journalism, he had a column there. He moved his American Grandstand column there. He wrote a lot for the Austin Chronicle. He had a regular reviews section in Entertainment Weekly. And there is some work going on behind the scenes to get an anthology put together of the work he did or has done since Fortunate Son was released in 1985. So hopefully that is something that will come to light in the next couple of years. Again, thank you, everyone. That was amazing. And can't thank you enough. We kick off again tomorrow morning with a session on music and community. And then we've got 2 sessions in the afternoon on music and activism, one looking at race and class and one looking at health and justice. So with that, we'll sign off for today's edition of Land of Hope and Dreams.